Bueno, pues buenas tardes a todos. Muchísimas gracias por estar aquí en esta sesión. Llevamos todo el día ya teniendo ideas nuevas y trabajando y dialogando sobre los conceptos que van surgiendo. Y quería dar en esta ocasión la bienvenida a Jenkins. Es la segunda vez que la Universidad de Alcalá le acogen de forma encantada, maravillosos. Ojalá hubiese podido ser de forma presencial y poder estar otra vez en nuestro edificio del rectorado, pero no ha podido ser. Muchas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros. Muchas gracias a todos los asistentes y os animamos a dialogar después de la presentación con Pilar y con Jenkins a través del chat, de Discord y de las redes sociales que estamos utilizando a lo largo de todo este congreso. Bienvenido.
Henry, no sé si me escuchas hablar en español. Espera, perdón.
I'm hearing you now. I don't know either.
Oh, ok. Estoy hablando en español. ¿Me escucha en español?
I hear you.
Ok, thank you. Bueno, la verdad que para mí presentar a Henry es el mayor honor que tengo, porque Henry ha sido mi maestro y Henry, yo creo que cuando alguien me pregunta si soy fan, yo creo que soy fan de Henry Jenkins. Entonces, pues es interesante verle aquí juntos en la pantalla. Bueno, hablando más formalmente, Henry es Provost Professor en USC, en la Universidad del Sur de California. Y bueno, yo admiro de Henry, pues en primer lugar sus libros. Bueno, sus libros que están absolutamente unidos a su personalidad. Es una personalidad absolutamente abierta. Enseña a mirar el mundo con ojos nuevos. Es enormemente creativo. Y yo destacaría de sus libros, bueno, el primero, Textual Coches, también el que más nos ha influido quizás, Participatory Culture, Convergence Culture, pero también sobre todo su blog. Yo os animo a ver su blog cuando queráis ver cosas innovadoras. También valoro muchísimo su último libro de entrevistas. En fin, Henry es un maestro, tanto a nivel de investigación como a nivel de persona y también como docente. Yo le conocí en el MIT, le he visitado muchísimas veces. En el MIT yo creo que era como una isla de humanidad en el Comparative Media Studies, y luego pues se trasladó a la Universidad del Sur de California, donde yo creo que se hacen las mejores cosas que hoy se hacen en realidad digital. Pero él también está en Annenberg School, que es la escuela de periodismo. Entonces, Henry, para nosotros es un enorme honor, y quería también destacar su colaboración con la educación detrás de su espíritu de filólogo, de teórico de los medios, de héroe de muchas personas. Pues yo creo que también es un investigador enormemente preocupado por la educación, y la presentación que va a hacer hoy pues es un ejemplo en estos tiempos tan difíciles de la pandemia, que nos han cambiado la vida a todos, pero yo desde aquí, Henry, te doy muchos ánimos y todo va a ir para mejor, estoy segurísima. Muchas gracias por estar aquí y la audiencia es tuya.
Thank you, Pilar and Ruth. It's great to be here virtually, if not in person. And I send my fond regards across the ocean. Today, I'm going to be sharing for the first time the results of an initiative we launched about a year ago called the Atlas of the Civic Imagination. And this is very much a set of reflections on the world of COVID and the pandemic, but also thinking beyond that. Let's see where I'm at. I should make clear that this is not simply my own research, but the work of a team of graduate students and under the supervision of my collaborator and colleague, Sangita Shrestova, I'm not going to read every student's name here, but if you look at them, you will see that it's a mix of students of many races from many different parts of the world who've come together to do this research. And I'll talk a bit more about their role as we go forward. Move this box out of the way. Here we go. So I'm going to begin with a quote from one of the people who posted to our Atlas of the Civic Imagination. Montserrat is from Mexico, and they post, 2060 will not be a utopia or a dystopia. There might be flying cars and clean energy, but some basic human emotions will remain. We will still have to fight for equality, for justice, and a world for all of us, despite our differences. This requires hard work. A Holocaust happened, and we didn't learn to stop picking bigots as leaders. But we're also a world with rebels who fight for justice and equality. So that juxtaposition of utopia and dystopia is one that we're hearing a lot at the present moment. And I'm going to spend some time in this talk thinking about what to make of those two words and how they're shaping public response to the pandemic. So the second quote I begin with is from Henry Giraud, the educator, critical theorist, who wrote it in 2020 about the current moment. Reality now resembles a dystopian world that can only be imagined as a harrowing work of fiction. Yet as ominous as this foreboding appears, history is open, and how it will unfold hangs in the balance. With young people and others rising up across the globe, inspired, energized, and marching in the streets, the future of a radical democracy is waiting to be reimagined, if not reborn. Democracy needs to breathe again. And I flag here this, again, the concept dystopia, the sense of contrast at the current moment, and a constant repetition in Giraud's writing of this piece on the role of imagination and its relationship to social change. And then I highlighted here this phrase, democracy needs to breathe again, because it will figure in some interesting ways as we go forward. So I'm going to talk today about what we call the civic imagination. And the civic imagination we define as the capacity to imagine alternatives to current social, political, or economic institutions or problems. Put bluntly, one cannot change the world unless you can imagine what a better world might look like. And in that process of imagining a better world, the space of our everyday becomes charged with new possibilities. We come to see ourselves as civic agents capable of making change in the world. We come to imagine other possibilities for change. We come to see ourselves as a larger community capable of making change together. We develop an empathy and solidarity with other communities whose perspectives and experiences differ from our own. And for those who have been most oppressed and marginalized, we imagine freedom, dignity, equality, respect before we've directly experienced them. So we put all that together under this banner of the civic imagination, which has been the central focus of the work I've been doing these past few years. And we've done a variety of projects under this banner. So here we see popular culture and the civic imagination, case studies of creative social change. This is a book of 30 case study essays by mostly students in our research team, but also some very distinguished scholars around the world. They're from diverse backgrounds, diverse nationalities, thinking about how popular culture has provided resources to fuel the civic imagination of social movements around the world. And then below the young boy, which is actually my colleague Sangeeta Shristova's son, is holding our other book, Practicing Futures. which describes a series of workshops, which I'll say more about as we go forward. So these are just some of the things that we do through the Civic Imagination Project. This card's intended as a bit of a shout out to some of the books that shape our own thinking about the civic imagination. We're very much tied to earlier sociological conceptions of civic imaginations, to writing by and about fantasy and science fiction, the imagination. We're interested in work from the Black radical imagination, which has really come to fore for many people during the Black Lives Matter movement. We're also reading other writers from around the world, and among them Paulo Freire from Brazil, whose idea sort of helps us to think about the political valences of imagination. He writes that in The Teacher is Culture Worker, the imagination that takes us to possible and impossible dreams is always necessary. It is important to make it clear that imagination is not an exercise for those detached from realities, those who live in the air. On the contrary, when we imagine something, we do it necessarily conditioned by a lack in our concrete reality. So by studying our imagination of alternatives, we also witness the constraints we feel in our current situation. Imagination for Freire is a way of thinking beyond constraints, of beginning to spell out our demands for a better world, and is the starting point for social and political movements. Our approach to the civic imagination is rooted, first of all, in a concept I've spent my career thinking about, participatory culture, and its offshoots in participatory learning and participatory politics. It emerges from our collective experience of fandom, and we learned a great deal from forms of fan activism that we're seeing springing up around the world, from Harry Potter fans in the United States fighting for human rights, to K-pop fans from Korea and elsewhere who've been playing central roles in the debates about race and racism in America right now, where we respect and value their critical and creative engagements with popular culture, which my mentor, John Fisk, constantly reminded us when I was his student, that pop culture provides us resources by which we form our identity and process the world around us. We see the imagination not in individualized terms, but in collective terms. And similarly, we think about agency, civic agency, as a collective property, a process of imagining. We go beyond Benedict Anderson's notion of the imagined community to stress the imagining community, people coming together, sometimes temporarily, to imagine alternatives and to work to achieve them. And we're very committed to mapping the relationship, the connections between cultural practices and civic and political action. This was a theme John Fisk wrote a lot about, but he had lacked in his own time the ability to demonstrate it or prove it in the kinds of concrete ways we now have, both in terms of these connections are more visible in the age of the internet and global networked computing, and there's new theoretical tools for understanding what this link looks like, and that's what I'm drawing on today. Our work on the civic imagination began with work on young activist groups in the United States. And we looked at Invisible Children, which were concerned with human rights issues and child soldiering in Africa. The Dreamers, who were young immigrants, undocumented immigrants fighting for citizenship and education rights. Students for Liberty, which is a conservative student organization. Various American Muslim youth groups, and then two examples of fan activism, Harry Potter Alliance and the Nerd Fighters. And so coming out of that field work, the ethnographic interviews we did and observation, we wrote this book, By Any Media Necessary, the New Youth Activism, which came out in 2016, just in time for Trump to sweep into the White House. And all of those groups took some serious hits in the United States as a consequence of Trump's administration. But as we began looking at it, we got deeper and deeper into this concept of the civic imagination, which I've already defined for you. And what we've seen is youth groups, youth activist groups around the world are relying on popular culture as a shared vernacular to articulate their visions for social change. And we see this as not radically different from other generations which have drawn on shared stories to motivate and inspire their efforts for democracy. So that's why we use the figure here of George Washington and position him in relation to Frankenstein, Star Wars, Harry Potter, professional wrestling, Wonder Woman, and Thanatos to represent fantasies of social change for a generation of young activists. But previous generations in America, George Washington's generation, used names of Greek and Roman heroes to represent their desire for a restoration of classical democracy, because they were students of the liberal arts at elite colleges along the American coast. Or Martin Luther King's generation of civil rights leaders used the story of Exodus from the Bible to imagine their own movement from slavery into freedom as a story that they told themselves and that grew out of the shared experiences of the Black church. I should note that this book just won the award from the Pop Culture Association for Best Anthology of last year, and we're very proud of that. Okay, let me move forward. So these are just some of the cases that we talk about in the book, everything from Hunger Games and Marvel Comics to Hamilton to Bollywood dance to Smokey the Bear, and to even an alternative Girl Scout organization called Radical Monarchs are discussed there in terms of the ways they've helped young people to articulate and envision political values, social connections in the modern world. So part of what grew out of that research then has been we wanted to go into the field and use what we learned from these groups about the civic imagination to try to activate and engage communities of all kinds, both in the United States and elsewhere around the world. Altogether, my group research team has done 60 workshops so far with different groups. And another 30 have been done by some researchers in Pakistan who were interested in understanding notions of national identity in Pakistan. So we work across boundaries in the United States. We work in red states and in blue states with conservative groups as well as liberal groups. We certainly have some ethical boundaries that we observe. We're not going to work with hate groups. We're not going to work with groups that are destructive and anti-civic. But within that broader scope, we're trying to address the deep divides in the United States and the deep despair about totalitarianism that we encounter in many other parts of the world. So that we've been doing these workshops. We now have developed 6 of them, which we share in the instructions on how to do in our Practicing Futures book, which is described as a Civic Imagine Action Handbook. And these are workshops that can be done by educators, by social and activist groups, by churches, by all kinds of organizations that are interested in fostering greater civic engagement and participation. So part of what we've been doing in these groups is going to communities and asking them to imagine the future together, to think about the ideal world of 2060, what its properties may be, what its policies may be, and how we get there. And in that process, we step outside of what Stephen Duncombe describes as the tyranny of the possible. That voice we all hear in our heads that say that would be amazing, but we can never do it because, The government is too divided. The people can't come together and agree. There's no resources or money. And we want to go back to that state where someone like Martin Luther King was able to articulate a dream of a fully integrated society at a time when that was so far beyond the possibilities of what could be achieved in the United States. He was not blocked by the police dogs and fire hoses. Rather, he articulated what a better world would look like and helped people to pursue that fantasy and take risks to achieve it. And that's very much why we think to the future as we think about what civic alternatives might look like. So our workshops are designed for participation. Peter Dahlgren, who's inspired some of our thinking, tells us that one has to feel invited, committed, or empowered to enter into a participatory process. So creating an atmosphere, allowing people to come together and agree to suspend disagreements long enough to think long-term is really powerful. And so we tap what we know about participatory culture, politics, and learning to achieve that. And out of that comes the articulation of a utopian goal, which is meaningful in the way that it motivates our struggles to achieve it and provides yardsticks to measure what we've achieved. So utopianism is not to say we live in the perfect world now. It is to say we can articulate what we're fighting for, the steps we need to take to achieve it, and we can look at the world around us and see how far short we are of achieving that goal and what is blocking our success. And that's a kind of utopia as a provocation or a process rather than as a blueprint. So when pandemic hit, we had a toolkit ready to capture stories from our workshops. And the original idea was just to capture stories from workshops we were doing face-to-face around the country and around the world and post them so people could share and see each other's visions for the future. But realizing we're in for a long haul with the pandemic lockdown, the quarantine, we set it up so that it could capture stories from around the world tied to COVID. And here's the provocation we sent out. Think about the current moment, your situation, and what you see around you, your fears and concerns. Take a deep breath, inhale, exhale, and we're back at the idea that democracy needs time to breathe. Now think about something that inspires you, a story from popular culture, folklore, your faith, your childhood. The story could be nonfiction, fiction, or even fantasy. It could be something you have noticed happening around you. It could be a story about a person in your life. Imagine it is now the year 2060, and the world is as you would like it to be. What is possible in 2060? How do people live, engage, move around, learn, communicate, work, take care of themselves, etc.? Now, this was an artistic project. It was meant as a provocation. It was meant to be an intervention and help people process what was taking place in the here and now as the world seemed plunged deeper and deeper into crisis. We did not design it as a research initiative, but we're now at the place where we're starting to process the results of what we got, more than 250 submissions, and are trying to make sense of what we're hearing from these stories that people shared with us. The population is not representative in any statistically meaningful way. It is skewed toward English-speaking countries, although our grad students were able to translate to and from Spanish and from Vietnamese, and we're working on getting capacity to translate from other languages as stories continue to come in. And if you're interested in the project, we'd encourage you to help us spread the word and get more people in your countries to submit and share what they're thinking at the current moment. One of the reasons we launched this was we had heard in our earlier workshops again and again, narratives have changed, and people seemed invariably to believe that there needed to be a catastrophe. The world needed to melt down before the systems and institutions blocking us from achieving a better world could be displaced, before we could work together to achieve what we all knew was necessary. And so we were curious whether the pandemic represented the kind of catastrophe that would allow people to think past the current conditions and enter into the space of future-oriented civic imagination. And we think we're finding evidence that that is the case. So here's another person from Mexico City, Mexico, who wrote to us. We still remember 2020. So you remember Lilith is writing from a perspective in 2060. We still remember 2020. People remember how the world stopped and society hit the reset button. Remember tenderly how much damage we caused to our planet and how the pandemic brought us back together, although it physically separated us for a while. Each person sought for each other as they sought for themselves, and it caused an improvement in our environment. It brought changes we never thought could be reached in such a short period of time. Thinking about 2020 reminds us that when working together, marvelous things can be attained. It also humbles us down because the virus took over our lives catastrophically and made us learn how insignificant we are against nature's simple organisms. So here we see this odd temporality that crops up often in the stories we received, where we are both stuck in 2020 as we're writing this, and yet imagining 2020 as something that has been overcome, that people learn lessons from, the moment when society hit the reset button and rapid change became possible again. And this suggests to us that it is indeed the catastrophe that people have been imagining in their earlier stories. Another person from Mexico City writes, my negativity comes out as optimism for the future and a love for the past. Again, think about temporality. We have not made the progress we would have liked, and I cried and feared it for most of my life. We almost ended up killing all species on Earth. We broke out in war. The Schumann project is scarred. Now in the year 2060, I realized that it still wasn't the end. Beauty can be found forward and behind. Nothing was like we were told, and now we look back at our mistakes and achievements. Unready, but at peace. And this is that kind of odd temporality, looking backwards and forwards and trying not to look at the present, that crops up in so many of the stories that we heard here. And it's consistent with the jokes people make about COVID time and not remembering how long ago something was, that we're in a temporal flux right now. Now, these terms, utopia and dystopia, in science fiction carry a particular history. They serve particular functions, but they're less separate, we think, than most casual uses of those terms might suggest. So here I have some art from the solar punk movement, which has sought over the last handful of years to imagine sustainable, environmentally reasonable futures. And a utopia almost invariably is a comment on the present, a comment that is critical of what is dystopian about the present moment. And often those dystopian elements still come with a trace. So solar punk technology is kind of ragtag. It's thrown together. It's jugaad, use a term they borrow from Thailand. But it is also beautiful, and it taps the Art Nouveau movement in particular. And I'm sure in Spain, Gaudi's work comes to mind when I talk about Art Nouveau architecture and that organic imagery of it. So it is a beautiful future, a bright future, but it comes at the end of the catastrophe of some kind of environmental meltdown that forces people to go back to the basis and move forward. And dystopias in science fiction almost inevitably contain images of what a better world would look like, and often organizations and individuals that are fighting to achieve that better world. And what drives the narrative of a dystopian story is that struggle to change a society which has gone wrong, to hit the reset button to get it back on track again. Now, we see this moment of imagining as one that enables the grasp of civic agency. And civic agency, remember, for us is collective. It's a process of agency. It's a process of imagining together and then acting to achieve our imagination, which is to what degree part of what we take from Freire. We also take insights from Gloria Anzaldúa. Sorry, my Spanish is horrible. Worst place to mispronounce that name. But she tells us that imagination is an active, purposeful creativity that bridges the body to nature, the spirit to mind. Imagination offers us another way of knowing and doing, a process that extends perception beyond bodily confines, that transforms our consciousness and our perception from ordinary reality to a spiritual, magical other reality. The imagination helps us to cultivate a pretend reality and act as though you're already in that pretend reality. Eventually, that reality becomes the real one, at least until you change it again. So this idea that reality may be more fluid than we perceive it, and that the act of imagining is the first step toward changing what we dislike about the world we're in right now, that we're not stuck. We have to find paths forward. And that's what we think people spend a lot of time doing. So as we looked, as my research team looked at this 200 plus stories, we began to identify key themes. And I'm going to talk just about a couple of them in the talk today and share with you some of the more voices of what we heard. And I'm not going to comment from here a lot on these voices. I think they speak powerfully for themselves, both in their distinctiveness and in the patterns that emerge across them. And they give us a glimpse into the possible futures that people have imagined during COVID and what people around the world seem ready to fight to achieve. Now, imagination is not enough in this model. The imagination has to be activated, and then the body has to be activated, both the social body and the physical body, to begin to achieve some of the changes we hope for. When we see persistent themes across these stories, they really speak in important ways. The future would be eco-friendly, egalitarian, and kind. Perhaps over the next 40 years, people will change their minds and new policies will usher in a golden age unlike any other in history. Maybe this is too optimistic, but this is how I'd like to picture the future. This is how I overcome all the terrible things that are happening today. There are 40 years between now and 2060. That reminds me of the biblical story where the freed slaves from Egypt spent 40 years wandering around the desert before they found the promised land that God had chosen for them. Perhaps some of us will not live until 2060, and it is even more unlikely for our parents. But it is our children and grandchildren who will determine the future, and I hope they will create a future that is much better than the present we live in. Kelly from Chandler, Arizona. Many people talked about climate. That is maybe the most persistent theme that we saw. And so it tells us that climate change is a source of worry everywhere on the planet, but people can imagine ways of moving beyond our current crisis. So 2060, the air is so clean and we take blue skies for granted now. The streets are lined with lush green unruliness. No one trims or edits nature anymore. The only motor vehicles that exist are for public transportation. Money isn't our primary mode of transaction now. We depend a lot more on our neighbors than ever before. Everything is slower. We move at the languid pace of cows. We have the discipline of wasps building their nest. We keep things simple like street dogs. We understand that we're a part of a bigger whole. The trees are kings and queens. They rule us, we live in their shade. Purnima from Delhi, India. And these beautiful imagery that crops up in this and other stories of different kinds of relationships to nature. Kate from Vermont says, a key thing that has changed between 2020 and 2060 is that there is equal pay for everyone, no matter race and gender. This changed because why pay people differently because of those details, especially if they're doing the same job and working the same hours? It just doesn't make sense. And the unequal pay was causing outright outrage by many, and for good reason. Another thing that changed was the people on Earth now have limits on the things they're putting into the environment, like fuel, trash, greenhouse gases, etc. People are doing this to help the global crisis of climate change, and it is noticeably helping. So the way in which Kate connects equality of opportunity and payment with a kind of relationship to nature that is more nurturing and promotes environmental sustainability is striking, but also crops up again and again in the accounts that were shared. Steve from Detroit tells us, upon seeing the downspike in emissions during the pandemic, we drive, fly, and pollute less. The air is cleaner. You could safely swim in the Chicago River. We still aren't perfect. Many of our current problems are still rampant, but we're more conscious of the safety of the people and the world around us. People remember 2020 as a disruption before the new normal. From Delik from Istanbul wrote a poem, which reads in part, chaos came with its healing glare. Yesterday's daunting destruction bared tomorrow's hopes and salvation. After all, it was in the hands of the people. Decades passed with moments of upheaval. One learned to listen, to emphasize, and to respect. The humankind needed to acknowledge the neglect. So the sense of connecting natural healing, the healing of the environment, with the healing of the human soul is a central theme here. Now, this being about the future, technology shapes so many of our assumptions about the future, and imagery from science fiction entered these stories rather a lot. Technology is both benign and destructive in these stories. So Emmy from North Carolina says, starts out as a future civilization with a benevolent robot as the controller of the world. But eventually, rather than the robot trying to take over the world, the people dedicated to curbing overpopulation start murdering people to gain control of society. And the robot who actually loves people can't do anything to stop them. In this society, for the most part, it's euphoric until this happens. So it's a little garbled, the language, but Emmy is describing a story of a robot overlord who's actually benevolent, who loves humanity and helps people build a better world. But humans fall back on their baser nature and start murdering people to gain control of society, and it ends up in a horrible state. So this is both utopian and dystopian, but rather than moving from dystopia to utopia, it follows the opposite path, where it's humans, not robots, that are the destructive force. Halisu from Illinois writes, the key thing that has happened between 2020 and 2060 is that the doomsday clock in Times Square, New York, has run out for many years now. Climate change is now irreversible, all because of the greedy humans that stole too much. When the clock initially hit zero, humans all thought that something would happen right away. A comet would hit the Earth or would start blowing up. What happened was worse. Everyone now lives in a constant state of worry and fear. New diseases are emerging and killing vegetation and humans. It was 10 times worse than COVID-19, but it isn't the viruses that are hurting people the most. It is the mental health issues. In an already anxiety-prone world, stress levels rise even more because of the fear of not knowing what will happen. Depression levels are magnified by the end of all humanity situation. So this, even though he was asked to envision a better world, many people had trouble doing that and ended up describing this inevitable path that they saw toward the end of the human race due to the destruction of the environment. And we saw a lot of this in the stories we received. Finally, there was a lot of talk about global politics, a new world order. So Puppy from Dong Nai in Vietnam wrote, for the past 2 months since COVID-19 came, our daily routine has been turned upside down as if our life has stopped. Medication and vaccines have not come out yet. This is truly horrible. Our future is bleak. Although in Vietnam, our government has strictly controlled the spread of COVID-19, and there's been no active case for 2 weeks, we can't be complacent. Even in America, that is praised as a free and rich country with exceptional healthcare, they couldn't cope with this pandemic. So here was a theme that cropped up a lot in the responses we got from Vietnam, where one of our students was from, and we got several classes full of responses. But the sense that America failed and is failing the world, but has to give way to something else, crops up a lot. From Brazil, from Sao Paulo, Brazil, compared to 2020 and 2060, our resources are scarce. Due to global warming, growing food was not as easy as before. Finding water is also complex following global warming. Most of the countries have polluted their sources of clean water. Otherwise, after 5 years of weather severity and the COVID-19 epidemic, all the countries decided to join forces to fix the planet. Now war is not a word in our vocabulary anymore. The deaths caused by pandemic and global warming effects have created a wave of peace in the world. Many of the people would like to remember the number of resources they had back in 2020. So many people and organizations warned about the risk to our planet. Unfortunately, global leaders decided not to hear it. And what I find fascinating here in the two statements in red is they represent two contradictory visions of the future. One where global leaders refuse to listen, fail to hear the warnings, and the other where countries finally decide to join forces to fix the planet. And so we have both dystopia and utopian possibilities in the same narrative. So a few final reflections people gave us. For me, Daniel from Portugal, for me personally, I've given up too many times already, thinking about the situation, thinking I'm not able to overcome this. Why? Because this world is not meant for the weak and I'm not strong enough. Despite all the difficulties, despite all the things that dragged me down, I've always found a way to get back up. And that's us, mankind. I've never been alone and neither have you. But in one way or another, when times get rough, we seem to isolate ourselves, and we should know that you and me alone can't carry the weight of the world on our shoulders. So let's take this time to change, to strive for a better world, a world reborn of compassion and empathy. We can do it. We're capable of doing great things if we put our mind into it, and we've already taken so much from our world. Let's take less and give back more. Or Manny from Atlanta, where I am right now. Communication is vital to our survival. Where there is no communication, there can be no community. And when there is no community, there is nothing. Imagine if people were able to thoroughly and definitively listen to someone who did not share their exact same beliefs, backgrounds, and experiences. Imagine if people were able to challenge the idea and not the person. We would truly have the world at our fingertips. So that's a beautiful example of the civic imagination at work. This is the last piece I'll read from the atlas, is from a girl, Isabel, whose sister died of COVID a few months before she wrote this. It's a letter to her sister. She says, I hope you are well, wherever you are. It makes me thrilled to think that you are reading this with your biggest and most genuine smile. I still remember when you were 22 years old, how excited you got thinking about the future, which kept you up every other night imagining what the world would look like, things that would exist, things that would change. I would like to tell you that everything has changed, that there are flying cars, that cures for incurable diseases have been found, that poverty has ended, and the wars have been stopped. But I would be lying to you. However, some things have changed. We became more human. As humanity, we have faced many challenges. After the pandemic that you lived and in which we lost you, we have found many other and more lethal battles. We struggle to understand the damage caused by our lifestyle of irresponsible consumption. We have bonded with each other, of course. We are no longer filled with hatred, selfishness, and individualism. Pain and necessity have changed us. I know you would be proud of the transformation we have achieved, and even more so, to be part of it. I love you. I miss you. I reminisce of you, your beloved sister, Isabel. And to wrap things up, I'll return to Henry Giroux, where you quoted at the beginning of this talk. And he writes in that same piece, amid the corpses produced by neoliberal capitalism and COVID-19, there are also flashes of hope, a chance to move beyond the contemporary resurgence of authoritarianism, beyond the normalizing ideologies of a poisonous cynicism and paralyzing conformity endemic to neoliberal capitalism. There's a growing movement to reclaim a collective political vision that is more compassionate, equitable, just, and inclusive. And I hope you saw those flashes of hope and that potential collective political vision in the pieces of writing I read you from this Atlas of the Civic Imagination. A challenge I think we all face as scholars is to hold on to and articulate what we're fighting for and not just what we're fighting against. And as human beings, to do our part to mobilize the civic imagination as a resource for collective hope and change. And with that, I will shut down my power presentation and take your questions or comments.
Bueno, voy a hablar en español porque creo que las emociones se transmiten mucho mejor, pero voy a poner creo que las emociones se transmiten mucho mejor a través de la propia lengua, ¿no? No sé si hay alguna pregunta, pero bueno, querría hacerle una, porque Henry ha sido siempre mi maestro. Y bueno, yo tengo la impresión de que Henry ha evolucionado, y para mí esto es muy relevante, de ser un intelectual siempre comprometido, pero comprometido con los alumnos y la sociedad, pero también con el mundo intelectual, ¿no? Por ejemplo, él ha sido un teórico de los medios en la cultura participativa y la gente lo hemos considerado como, pues como un maestro intelectual, ¿no? Pero ahora yo creo que está, no lo sé, pero no sé si está hablando como un activista. Yo quiero ser activista, yo quiero transformar la sociedad. Pero detrás de todo esto hay también detrás unas ideas que están orientando, ¿no? Veo muy cerca las ideas de John Fiske, porque esta mañana lo estaba leyendo, acerca de el papel del poder, ¿no? Y entonces, no sé, me gustaría que Henry me explicase un poco su evolución intelectual. A lo mejor estoy equivocada, a lo mejor yo estoy dando una interpretación que no es correcta, pero veo que ahora le interesa la opinión de la gente, el cambio. Y tengo también una última cuestión que me llama mucho la atención. Aquí hemos tenido a otros conferenciantes, como por ejemplo Jim G. o Stefan Poronka esta mañana, ¿no? Entonces ellos dan, a lo mejor lo estoy interpretando, mucha importancia a la persona, no sé si al individuo, pero a la propia experiencia personal. Y yo en Henry siempre he percibido que él valora la colectividad. Y este trabajo es una muestra de que estamos ante un pensamiento colectivo que no renuncia a los individuos. Y me callo para siempre porque si no, no me callaría nunca. Y bueno, está abierto y cada uno que quiera se le dará entrada. Pero esta pregunta no me la podía callar.
Well, thanks for that. And as always, Pilar, you're one of the most perceptive readers of my work and someone who has been a beloved disciple. So it is great to hear your perspective on the direction our work is taking now. And yes, I do think there is a larger social vision at work. It's not just me. I think everyone that surrounds me is moving in a more social, civic, political direction. We're an age of activism again. And I try to study that activism, but I also try to inspire it through the work that we're doing. I'm trying to sample voices and give them back to communities. I used to joke that John Fiske was the Johnny Appleseed of cultural studies. This figure of Johnny Appleseed in American folklore was one who traveled across the American wet frontier planting apple seeds everywhere he went, and that's why apple seeds grow across so much of America. So Fiske was the person who went from studying under Raymond Williams to going to Australia, to going to the United States and Canada to spread cultural studies. And I was lucky enough to study under John several times, first in my master's degree at Iowa and then my PhD at Wisconsin. And from him, we got the sense that change was possible. Fiske was an optimist, and that's why critical studies has often attacked Fiske for that optimism, but I cannot help myself but be an optimist. And I think there's an important role to be done in critical studies in articulating our hopes as well as our fears and worries. I think that there's an important role for counterbalance in critical studies. And I think that critical studies often, I would say, gets so hung up with the problems and the things it's fighting against that it doesn't articulate very well what it's standing for or what its hopes or dreams are. And to me, critique is an important element, but part of a larger process that begins with documentation and an analysis of conditions. Then you can critique when you know what's actually going on and you have a frame to think about it through. But critique then comes to advocacy for alternatives that you believe are possible, and then intervention to achieve those alternatives. And scholars have roles each stage of that process, and that process is one we need to embrace as scholars through our work. So I am at a process of intervention right now. I'm certainly still writing critical essays and describing and documenting aspects of the world, but the work we're doing right now is in the world, it is in the field, it is working with community groups across the country and in other parts of the world, and working with people who want to make change. And we're making resources for that, whether it's the Practicing the Future book that offers instructions on how to do our workshops, or it's the Atlas of the Civic Imagination, or we did a toolkit for parents who were homeschooling their kids on how to use media constructively to think about the imagination and civics with very, very young children. Because the idea of screen time, which had been used to teach parents for decades, broke down last year, in case you didn't notice, that everything is screen time, and therefore thinking if that screen time is the problem rather than how we use screens became an unsustainable proposition. So we offer there for parents a vision of how to use screens more constructively. So yeah, it's an interventionist mode of cultural scholarship that I represent. And it's whether it's intervention with teachers or activists or industry organizations, it's always trying to be in the world and make a difference in the world.
Henry, muchísimas gracias. Y hay manos levantadas, me han dicho que está la mano de Moisés. Moisés, ¿puedes preguntar?
I'm with my kids, sorry, and with the kind of chaotic circumstances now, but I wanted to just say thank you so much, Perry, for inspiring us, for your work. I really love, I totally agree with Pilar that you focus on the collective character of our society, of internet as a public space, a private one as well, but a public space to interthink collective in order to improve our world. And your idea of civic imagination, it reminds me a book written by Levitas, that the title of the book is Utopia's Method, the Imaginary Reconstitution of Society. And Levitas argues that utopia should be considered as method rather than a goal or blueprint. And listening you, I think that it should be considered something collective, not something static or unidirectional as utopia. Why not talking about re-topia as a collective participatory process, an ongoing process to improve the world, the circumstances, and to apply this imagination into the reality, no? Into transforming educational circumstances as you are doing. I just wanted to say thank you so much, Henry, again for your work and for inspiring us. And it's just a comment. It's not a question or something like that.
Well, thank you for that comment. I think you and Pilar are absolutely right to stress the collective here. You know, the notion of the community or the communalism is an important basis for the work that I do. And it's important to us that we think of imagining as a process, and more than just an individual process, but a collective one. And I think that's the core of what we mean by the civic imagination. I made a passing reference to Benedict Anderson, whose idea of imagined community has been helpful for us, but we came to see that notion of imagine in the past tense is far too static for the process that we're talking about. And he's describing imagined community in a world where it is impossible for everyone to know the members of a nation state. But a network has a different access. It's still probably not the case you know everyone in your network, but it is now possible to communicate with everyone in your network and to hear the voices of people in your network. We need to be concerned about who's not included in those networks, right? So I talk about a more participatory culture now, and not simply a participatory culture, because we have to continually stress who's silenced. And here I think about all the students around the world who couldn't get online during the pandemic and suffered a year without education as a marker of the problems we have of achieving a fully collective society. But the collectivity is an important part of it. And I don't see the collectivity as a threat to individualism, but as a fulfillment of individual desires in a community setting.
No sé si hay más cuestiones que se les daría la voz, porque es mucho mejor que cada uno se exprese con su propia voz. ¿Hay alguna otra persona? Si no, yo leeré algo que hay por aquí. ¿Quiere alguien más? ¿Ha levantado la mano?
Hay manos levantadas. Dayana, se permite hablar a Dayana, cuando quieras.
Ay, Ruti, controla tú, que no lo veo.
Hi, Henry. Your speech is very powerful and inspired. Thank you for sharing us your work. I have a question. In the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned Freire, who I consider as an example of someone who imagined a world that didn't exist, and yet he created that world in education, or well, he tried it, right? Do you think that the philosophy of Freire is really part of what we can say is the present? I mean, is something that is happening now, or is something that is still need more process in the future to be a reality?
Well, I think he gave us a series of tools for thinking about how to imagine together. And I find that the essays and the teacher is culture worker, which that quote came from, really a powerful blueprint that shapes some of the design of the workshops we're involved with. I won't say that all he's changed education around the world. Clearly not, right? There are pockets of Freire's thinking being put in action in many countries around the world, but no one person changes the entire planet at once. And his writing has proven to be very difficult to absorb in the American context, where the overt Marxist language makes it very difficult to share with teachers or policymakers in the United States, where anti-communism runs high at the moment. So, but I found that this essay on the imagination is one that can be quoted and discussed and can be an entry point to the ideas outside of that kind, language that's difficult to be heard in many of the circumstances I'm speaking. But I've always found his thinking empowering, inspirational, important part of how I think about participation. And more, we're relying on his words to help carry weight for the kinds of arguments that we're making, because I think he so powerfully articulated a vision of what a more participatory, more imaginative form of education could look like, even as he grounds us in the challenges and inequalities that have to be overcome to fully achieve that vision.
Thank you very much. I completely agree with you. I like the idea of the participation and how a community can be changed, things in education, in environment, etc. So thank you a lot.
Thank you.
No sé quién había más.
Le damos la palabra a Julián de la Fuente, que tiene la mano también levantada.
Henry, muchísimas gracias por esta tan sugerente conferencia. Me vais a permitir, pero tengo que contar una cuestión personal que me ha pasado. Es que la primera vez que conocí a Henry Jenkins fue en Alcalá, también por otro acto que tuvimos, en el que impartió una conferencia precisamente sobre las escuelas de samba. Yo entonces prácticamente acababa de empezar la tesis. Lo que más me recuerdo de aquella conferencia, y que hoy lo he visto con otros ojos después ya de muchos años y de muchas lecturas y de haber leído mucho tanto a él como a otros autores, es precisamente la capacidad que tienes para poder trasladar justo lo contrario que hacemos el resto de los académicos, ¿no? Que intentamos llevar la teoría a la práctica, intentamos buscar esas ideas teóricas que luego nos permiten ir al campo a investigar y a buscar resultados, ¿no? Y viendo esta conferencia es que tu forma es justo lo contrario, es conseguir trasladar la práctica a la teoría, conseguir ir a las comunidades de base, a la cultura popular, a esos movimientos como aquella escuela de samba o como ahora habéis hecho con este atlas de imaginación cívica, y conseguir construir una teoría a partir de eso. Me parece que es algo pues digno de un genio, porque no puede ser de otra manera, pero me gustaría preguntarte si en este caso fue así, o sea, fue una inspiración a base de tu observación, que me consta que ha sido muy concienzuda de esas comunidades de fans, o ha habido el camino de alguna manera inverso, sino que habéis intentado trasladar toda esa conciencia que teníais del poder de la cultura popular para cambiar las actitudes y sobre todo los movimientos cívicos y el compromiso cívico hacia estas comunidades de base.
Well, I think the key to understanding me is that I grew up as a fan, and that involvement in a community that was theorizing media in a grassroots way and describing their passions, thinking critically about stories they cared about, and actively rewriting them inform how I do everything, right? So that's one factor. And the other is my father, who was a construction company owner, built buildings. And he said two things to me that I clung to. One was he showed me a building he'd built 20 years before. And he asked me, what will you build that will still be around in 20 years? And alas, he'd passed away before Textual Poachers came out on a 20th anniversary edition. But the thrill that I had holding that book and realizing that I'd written something that was still around for 20 years. But he also called PhDs doctors that can't do you any good, and a kind of skeptical about the value that PhDs brought to society. So I always wanted to be a doctor who could do some good. who could engage with actual communities in the world and translate my work into language that could be understood by everyday people. And so, yes, I go to the field, I observe, I engage, I'm involved in conversations. My life is one long conversation with different people, and I try not to always talk, but also to listen and learn from everyone I meet. And then translating that into the theory, rather than starting with an a priori set of assumptions that governs how I see everything. I'm testing the theories that are available to us against what I observe in the world. And I'm always of the theory of the idea that we should change our theory every few years, like we change oil in our car every few months, right? We need to swap it out because a theory gets used up in terms of what it allows us to see, and we need to move beyond it. And so I'm constantly searching across all different disciplines for theoretical tools that can best explain what I'm observing in the world and translate the structure of feeling in the world into something that can be more universally communicated. And that involves simplifying theory, not in a sense of dumbing it down, but making the theory more concrete and accessible to people so that people who aren't living in the academic world of high theory can understand the stakes of our theorization and how they might apply them in a consequential way. But yes, I remember very well that the Samba school talk that I gave there some years ago. So.
Gracias, de verdad.
No sé si hay alguna otra pregunta. Yo tengo otra, si no. ¿Hay
Adelante,
alguna
Pilar.
concreta? Bueno, Henry, yo tengo una que, bueno, antes hablaba de la civic engagement y ahora habla de civic imagination, y siempre leí en la idea de los jóvenes, el civic engagement de los jóvenes, que era algo muy distinto a la participación política del voto, y me parece claro que estos ejemplos que has puesto son obviamente de civic engagement. Bueno, no lo sé, me gustaría profundizar en ese concepto de cómo los jóvenes entienden la participación política de otra manera. Recuerdo que me decías que en España habíamos tenido el 15M, que había sido un movimiento juvenil que ahora se ha transformado y ha acabado bastante mal. Entonces ahora a mí me preocupa otra cosa que estamos percibiendo muchísimo, y es que ahora hay otros jóvenes que son muy diferentes de los que tú has presentado ahí. Es como si fueran jóvenes que viven en los barrios altos de Hollywood, pero que aquí en España y concretamente en Madrid tienen mucho poder. Entonces esos jóvenes piensan de otra manera. Yo creo que están lejos del concepto de justicia social que tenemos nosotros, muchas de las personas que estamos aquí, pero también, no sé, yo tengo una duda ética de cuál es nuestro papel ahí. Una vez dijiste que era el ejemplo. Recuerdo que diste este ejemplo cuando uno de los estudiantes en Alcalá te preguntó cuál era el papel de los profesionales de los medios cuando había gente que estaba participando haciendo sus propios productos en la red. Entonces, yo ahora no sé cómo abordar esto, porque está teniendo profundas consecuencias en la política populista que yo creo que vivimos en Estados Unidos y, desde luego, clarísimamente en España. No sé si me he
You're asking
expresado.
all the right questions with this, and the questions I struggle with on a regular basis. So I've had an ongoing series of public conversations with Nico Carpentier, who thinks about participation as I do, and we've been struggling with this question of what constitutes ethical participation. How do we agree, if we respect the voices of the public, but some of those voices are so destructive to democracy, how do we understand what that is? right? And Nico and I come at this from different vantage points, but I'm struggling with, to me, participation that is destructive to other participants is unethical participation. That participation which seeks to shut down participation is unethical participation. That's a difficult standard to live with, right? I can't deny the reality that's the insurrection on Washington, the white supremacy groups that we're seeing in the United States are participatory in broad principles and have within them many young people whose ideas of the world are shaped by the same forces as the young people I've written about who are doing social justice work, who were fighting struggles for inclusion in American society. And that's the paradox of the current moment. That is, there is something about participation that's run outside of any shared norms, shared values, that's deeply destructive. And having a president who uses Twitter as a participatory channel or something that is seen as a participatory channel to encourage a dismantling of democratic norms and institutions is a deeply troubling thing. And there's a piece Nico and I wrote together coming out called "Why Does God Need a Spaceship?" which is really a line from Star Trek, but it really is a question of why does Trump need Twitter and what the effect of Trump's use of Twitter has been on democratic movements around the world. So that troubles me a lot. I do believe, you know, young people, many young people are thinking about social justice in a very active way, are thinking intersectionally and forming alliances across groups that once would have been held separate. I do see young people around the world as generally a progressive force. But one, I'm not so naive as to deny the reality that some of these movements lead in destructive directions and some things are going, and young people are being recruited into white supremacist directions, into angry white male directions, you know, so forth. That Gamergate is a form of participatory culture, just one that I would see as deeply unethical in its practices and norms. So this is a difficult question. It's a test of the power of theories of participatory culture, learning, and politics. Can we account for it analytically? Can we critique it? Can we pose alternatives to it? And can we work to intervene to achieve them? I don't have the answers to those questions yet to my own satisfaction. But as I'm doing this work on civic imagination, which is largely optimistic, I'm also struggling with my pessimism of what I've seen in my country and in other countries around the world in the last 4 or 5 years.
Sí, porque tengo un ejemplo que me fue, bueno, tengo la impresión de que la gente joven vive como en guetos. Cada uno vive en un gueto, que es su medio. Por ejemplo, explorando TikTok, que estudiaba las comunidades de fans en TikTok y ahora, bueno, TikTok es la aplicación estrella, al menos en España, y veía, por ejemplo, un artículo sobre la estética de TikTok y ahí salía una influencer presentando formas de vida, pues fancy, no sé, cool, no sé cómo llamarlas. Era una estética, pues, de la clase alta, pero frente a esa comunidad había otra que no tenía ninguna relación, que era una comunidad pues de Black Lives Count, los negros cuentan, ¿no? Pero lo más grave, a mi juicio, era que la influencer de clase alta estaba apropiándose de las estrategias que estaban usando en la otra comunidad. Es decir, unos toman las estrategias de otros y aquí entramos también en el papel de las empresas que están utilizando las estrategias de los fans para vender sus productos totalmente lejos de la justicia social. Y entonces no sé cómo podemos entrar ahí, o a lo mejor es mejor pues ser ejemplos de lo que hacemos y bueno, pues ese es el camino que tenemos ahora. No vamos a cambiar el mundo, ¿no?, en una tarde.
Well, I think we are seeing the appropriation of fan practices by companies and by right-wing organizations around the world. And what is that implication for us as critics and analysts? As we spell out how these things work, are we providing toolkits for groups that we disagree with? It goes back to the ethical norms that we apply in choosing which community groups to work with. And we will work with conservative groups or groups of people that are conservative, but we wouldn't work with the Ku Klux Klan or white supremacist groups. We're trying to figure out how we bring better dialogue in the United States between conservative and democratic, because we find there's a lot of shared desires, even if there's not a shared vision of how to achieve them. So to give an example, we were in Kentucky, small town Kentucky, and brought together former coal miners and tobacco farmers, both of whom are never going to get the jobs back that they had in the past because the world has moved on from those things. And they were desperate. And when we talked to them, these are all people who voted for Trump and for Republicans for the Senate and House. The most Republican leaders, in fact, for the Senate and the House come from Kentucky. And when we talked to them, they wanted healthcare. And they wanted a healthcare program that, when they described it, was very much on Bernie Sanders' vision of healthcare. And they needed healthcare that followed them from job to job because they'd lost their jobs. They needed healthcare that protected them and their families. They had worked their lives physically. They were feeling pain. There were family members who were addicted to opioids, and they needed help. But when we asked to create a narrative of how we got from where we are now to this ideal future society, which had healthcare in it, and if we'd called it Obamacare or socialized medicine or whatnot, it would have been shut down. But they described it in great detail. When we asked how we got there, they were completely stumped. They didn't believe in any institution powerful enough to give them the healthcare they wanted. They didn't trust the government. They didn't trust industry. They didn't trust churches. They didn't trust universities or nonprofit organizations. There was nothing that had the power to give them healthcare that they desperately wanted and needed that they had any faith in. And so it wasn't that there was a disagreement on the left and the right about the need for such a program in the United States. It was the fundamental disagreement was about institutions and practices in the middle range that would get us there. But identifying that difference leads to the possibility of focusing on that problem and bridging some of those gaps within the political debate. And I think some of the debates about race in America stem from radically different experiences that people haven't communicated to each other. That the South, where I'm from, has undergone dramatic change toward a multicultural South. Even the idea of Black and white South communicating is now completely out of date because there's a Latinx South, and there's an Asian American South, and there's an American Muslim South that are woven into the society here. And yet no one has prepared the white South to think differently about what's taking place. And the result is fear, misperception, miscommunication. And people cling to symbols of the past that make them feel secure. And so to me, this debate about monuments that are taking place in the South and the getting rid of Confederate general monuments is opportunity to think differently, because it's not about what we negate and what we tear down, but what we put up to replace it. And can we collectively imagine other visions of the South that everyone feels a part of, that bridges the multicultural South, the many-racial South, and helps them to think together about what their future might be. And that's a fundamental work of rebuilding American society, which gets us beyond partisanship and toward thinking as a community where we hear voices that we may fundamentally disagree with. But within that, there are some poisons that you cannot contain. And the absolute racist, white supremacist logic is one of those things we have to tear down. But there are many, many Southerners who don't think that way, but haven't learned to think in multicultural and inclusive ways, intersectional ways either, that we have to bring into that conversation. And so for me, these are ethical questions of which communities we work with, what our processes of imagining are, and how we translate and publicize the products of imagination. So that, I mean, that's where I'm thinking as someone, as a Southerner watching this my country get torn apart and seeing so much of that pressure coming from people who grew up in the same neighborhoods I grew up with, you know, and went to the same kinds of schools I went to. I'm trying to figure out how to bridge those divides in a constructive way while never ignoring the need to critique what's bad about the current situation.
Gracias, Henry. Es muy inspirador y sobre todo para llevarlo a la práctica, porque es una posición constructivista en la que múltiples voces pueden convivir y es lo que hay. Y se trata de, bueno, pues sin violencia, llegarlo. Hay una última, muchas gracias, Henry. Hay una última cuestión de Alba que puede ella preguntarla si quiere.
Sí, Alba.
Alba.
Sí, buenas tardes. Bueno, lo primero de todo, muchas gracias por esta conferencia. Bueno, voy a tratar de recogerla un poco, o sea, buscarla por aquí arriba. Y bueno, sobre todo pedir disculpas a Stefan por si no he entendido bien el término, porque al fin y al cabo tiene que ver un poco con la conferencia que hemos escuchado de Stefan esta mañana. Bueno, Stefan esta mañana nos hablaba sobre el concepto de medium del presente, entendido este papel como la representación que las personas realizan del presente a través de sus prácticas sociales. Respecto a esto, ¿qué papel puede jugar esa representación en el proceso de imaginar el futuro en el presente? No sé si me he explicado bien.
Unfortunately did not hear the talk this morning, so I'm struggling based on what you've said to totally put it together. But media of the present and media representations of the present, you know, as I would use the term, are resources which we build on to construct the civic imagination. And they could be, for us, fictional resources. You know, we've done a lot of work with the Harry Potter Alliance, which uses Harry Potter stories to think about questions of equality, inclusion, human rights. And their magic is a form of power, and how magic is shared, who possesses magic, who's excluded from magic, and how they deploy magic toward better or worse societies, give that group a powerful metaphor using the media of the present to think differently about the world. And we partnered with them on a number of things where they have the summer program where they're training young activists, and they work with Black Lives Matter, they work with the Greta's environmental justice movement, they work with all kinds of activist groups, and they come together for a weekend. Used to be face-to-face, now it's digital this year, and they share their best practices, and they talk about how to sustainability, self-care, and joy, and the imagination as part of the activist process. But they're also responding to other media of the present, which would include news or social media, right? For which we're getting information, but also narratives, ideological narratives by which we process that information. And those tools are things that they're learning to use effectively to spread their message. So if we can think about Black Lives Matter, which began as a hashtag, right? Black Lives Matter starts as a hashtag, and it's a way of organizing data from across the US, right? About police violence in particular, about the killing of young Black men and women by the police. And these stories had been told in isolation and localized. So the idea that, you know, that this murder in this city is covered as a local news story, but when you start putting those pieces together around a hashtag, they become a pattern emerges. And we start to see in a convincing way the effect of structural and systemic racism in the United States. And so the ability of people to just say, look, this happened in my city and this happened in my city, and they're connected to each other, changed the narrative in such a powerful way that the Black Lives Matter movement came from that. And then once we have this narrative, we can add to it the Karens, right? These women who are, white women who are using their privilege to call the police to threaten Black bodies for various everyday practices, and the danger that poses to people when we see video after video on YouTube connected through social media, through Twitter and so forth of these Karens, then a different picture emerges of whiteness. And I, as a white person, could find it hard to see white supremacy behavior. It's not something whites perform for each other in the social classes and political communities I participate in, but seeing it again and again, seeing what it looks like, imagining what it feels like, changes my relationship to that information and makes it possible then for me to be more effective as an ally on behalf of social justice, racial justice in the United States. And as that happens, as more people have that experience, those stories start to come into the mainstream news, and we're seeing a different frame placed on these questions. And we're seeing our political leaders use terms like systemic racism and structural racism, which the right in the US is still nowhere near ready to do, but the left is using that frame that comes from the Black Lives Matter movement to talk about race and act on race. And so those are, to me, media of the present, and our relation to those representations of the present is fluid, but how we understand them is shaped by the civic imagination, the narrative frames we place around it. That shapes how we feel and think about these stories. It becomes an epistemological resource for processing what's happening in Black lives in the United States. And I keep returning to American examples because I know these problems take place elsewhere and these practices take place elsewhere, but as an American, I'm loath to ever comment on someone else's culture because Americans do that so often and so badly that I'm trying to focus on my culture and our problems, not as because I'm arrogant and see the US as the center of the universe, but because I'm trying to practice some ethical modesty and not comment on situations in Spain that I mostly know from my friend and colleague, Manuel Casals, who is now centrally involved in your government there at this point.
Henry, muchísimas gracias, de verdad. Es que ha sido un placer, hemos aprendido tanto. Esperamos verte aquí en España y sobre todo gracias por el mensaje de esperanza que nos has dado. Y bueno, vamos a volver a escuchar esto y ojalá también te podamos visitar en LA cuando todo esto haya pasado, que estoy segura que va a ser pronto. Y muchísimas gracias por esta conferencia en nombre de la organización, de los conferenciantes y de toda la gente que está participando y que te ha escuchado, y que lo pondremos también en las redes sociales para que la gente lo escuche y cambiar el mundo juntos. Gracias, Henry.
Thanks for having me and thanks for listening.
Thank you, Henry.
Take care.